press *9 when using the phone. You can type a question right into the chat box. Hannah will be moderating the chat and make sure your question is recognized and addressed. Or if you prefer, feel free to save any questions for the Q&A discussion at the end. All of the presentation slides will be emailed to folks who've registered for today's meeting. Great, so I'm gonna go over the agenda. We'll have welcome and a program overview, SCP active transportation and safety call overview, the community-wide or area plans, active transportation focused plans, project overview, community-wide or area plans with a safety focus overview, the quick builds and network visioning and implementation project types, and then we will wrap up with a Q&A session. We have some guest speakers to speak to a handful of these project types that we're really happy to have with us today. So I'm going to introduce myself again. I'm Julia Lippy-Klein, Program Manager for Local Planning in the Planning Strategy Department at SCAG. And I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues on the call today to introduce themselves. If everyone can share their name, title, and role with the program and role on this call, that would be wonderful. So I'll kick it over to Hannah.
Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Brunel. I'm a planner in the Planning Strategy Department at SCAG. And today I'll be talking about the quick builds and the network visioning project types.
And okay, so Courtney Aguirre, I'm a program manager for SCAG and also the Planning Strategy Department. And today I'll be walking you through some details related to our community-wide and area plans that are focused on safety.
Hi, I'm Corey Wilkerson. I'm also a program manager at SCAG. I work in the Mobility Planning and Management Department, and I oversee the active transportation program for the MPO component. I'll be covering the active transportation focused plans, as well as some of the program overview.
Great, and a nod to David, who is managing all of the tech and the slides and everything to keep us moving smoothly today. So huge thanks to David behind the scenes. I'd also like to ask folks participating today if you'd like to add your name and agency and jurisdiction that you are either representing or supporting. If you can add it to the chat, it'll help us understand who is here. And as you are doing that, David, will you go to the next slide, please? All right, before I jump into this timeline, we're going to launch a few polls very quickly to help us get another sense of who is on the call, who is interested in this program. David, do you mind launching that first poll? Great, so I'm going to read these out loud. Folks on the phone won't be able to participate. Apologies, but I'm going to read it so you know what we're asking. This first question is for folks to identify the county that you are joining from today. And we'll just take a few, maybe about 20 seconds or so more with this poll. Great. All right, I think we can end this one. About 67% from Los Angeles, 12% from San Bernardino County, 10% Riverside, 10% Orange County, and I think 2% from Ventura. Excellent. David, will you launch the next slide poll, please? All right, the second poll, we'd like to get an understanding of the type of agency or organization that you're representing. The options include a local jurisdiction, transit agency, council of governments, regional transportation agency, community-based organization, school district, public health agency, tribal government, consulting firm, or something else. All right, I think we can end the poll here. Majority of folks are representing local jurisdictions, looks like, followed by transit agencies and community-based organizations, as well as consulting firms. Great, thanks. And we have one last poll for you at this moment. This last question: does your agency have a recently, as in within the last 5 years, adopted active transportation safety or mobility plan? All right, I think we can end the poll there. Looks like about 57% do, 28% do not, and a handful of folks are unsure. Thank you so much for participating in those polls. It's very helpful to help us understand where we're at and where we need to go, especially with connecting with you all. All right, so I'm going to dive into a little bit of the program overview to kick us off. So as some background, SCAG has over 20 years of experience in visionary growth planning for the region. This planning grant program grew out of the Compass Blueprint vision process in 2000. At that time, SCAG started awarding small visioning grants to cities, and as a benefit, SCAG would take care of all the contracting. In 2010, SCAG conducted its first formal call for proposals. Today, the program is the Sustainable Communities Program. Next slide, please. All right, so the 2020-2021 Sustainable Communities Program primarily supports implementation of the 2020 RTP SCS Connect SoCal. What is new and unique this year is that we are providing multiple opportunities to seek funding and resources. We will really want to make sure that our efforts are addressing recovery and resiliency strategies, considering the impacts of COVID-19. The Active Transportation and Safety Call, we might call it AT&S, is now open. There will be others opening as well. And as the guidelines and information for those calls becomes available, we will release more information. For this call, successful applicants will receive technical assistance from SCAG. SCAG will complete the procurement for the proposed scope of work for the call. So some program-wide goals provide needed planning resources to jurisdictions for active transportation, multimodal planning efforts, sustainability, land use, and planning for affordable housing, promote and address and ensure health and equity, reduce motorized VMT and greenhouse gas emissions, and really just to develop local plans that support the implementation of key strategies and goals outlined in Connect SoCal's SCS. Few more here. The goal of the program is also to develop resources that support key connections outlined in Connect SoCal, support a resilient region, and generally increase the region's competitiveness for federal and state funds. So just a important note, as a key implementation tool for Connect SoCal, SCAG is prioritizing equity in each of the SCP program areas. The program-wide goals prioritize investments in disadvantaged communities, or DACs, and align with SCAG's adopted resolution on race and equity. The active transportation and safety calls pursuing a data-driven outreach approach to encourage DACs to apply and target DACs. Active transportation and safety call scoring criteria really prioritizes community engagement, specifically strategies to engage DACs and other marginalized groups. For subsequent calls, SCP will prioritize resources where there's a demonstrated need. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I was muted. So for the active transportation safety portion of the Sustainable Communities Program, we are trying to prioritize historically disinvested and communities of color to ensure that investments are focused in those areas. The focus is also going to be to increase safety and mobility for folks that are walking, biking, and rolling. Support local jurisdictions as they attempt to implement the goals, objectives, and strategies that we've outlined in Connect SoCal, as well as prioritizing projects, creating conceptual renderings and cost estimates for future ATP applications. We really want this to be a tool that local agencies can use to go after and secure additional funding sources. We want to integrate multiple funding streams and to increase the overall budget for active transportation. And then, of course, ensure that we're going to align and integrate the key connections outlined in Connect SoCal. Next slide. So kind of breakdown of the project types, and we'll get into a little bit more detail on this a little bit later, but community-wide or area-wide plans, there's an active transportation focused plans, which have a maximum award of $500,000, and transportation safety focused plans that have a maximum award of $250,000. One of the key differences between those two and why the budgeting is a little bit different is the availability of funding for the different types and the types of plans types of detail that will be in the plans. For an active transportation plan, we expect that there will be some level of engineering work involved, as well as engineering level cost estimates. Whereas with the transportation focused plans, while they're focused heavily on data, they should have more like planning level conceptual plans and planning level cost estimates. The quick build category are essentially interim capital improvement projects, commonly referred to as pilot projects or long-term demonstration projects. These might include protected bike lanes, scramble crosswalks, bulb outs or curb extensions. We'll get some more details about that later. And then the network visioning and implementation category, which has a maximum award of 1.25, is essentially merging the two. It will involve an active transportation network visioning planning effort, followed immediately by a quick build implementation. So the idea there is that you're planning for something, and then the community sees some implementation of that plan immediately after. Next slide, please. So these are some of the types of plans that we might expect: transportation safety focused plans, citywide active transportation plans, first last mile plans, local road safety or safe systems plans, the network visioning, pedestrian master plans, and quick build projects. Next slide. Some examples of some of the efforts that we've funded in the past. Next slide, please. This is a list of the eligible applicants: cities, counties, transit agencies, councils of government, RTPAs, public health departments, natural resources, public land agencies, public schools, school districts, tribal governments. Nonprofit organizations or community-based organizations are not eligible to apply directly. However, they are definitely encouraged to partner with one of the eligible applicants in pursuing funds. We do like to see applications that include community-based partners on them. Next slide. So the online form will take approximately 45 to 60 minutes to fill in once you have all the content has been prepared. In addition to cleaning the online form, approximately 8 to 12 hours of commitment are needed for developing all of the attachments and so forth. But we do anticipate that this is a relatively easy application to fill out, especially compared to other applications like the Active Transportation Program. And that was really our goal with this. Next slide, please. So SCP does use ATP funding. And as such, we will consider ATP Cycle 5 submitted applications that were not selected for funding at either the statewide level or at the MPO level. However, our program does have different scoring criteria and different focuses. So one thing that we do want to encourage folks to consider is submitting, even if they have submitted an ATP Cycle 5 application already, to take that application and perhaps reformat it and look at some of the goals and objectives of the SCP program to better cater their application to the SCP program, which will allow them to essentially be able to compete twice for these funds, either as a Cycle 5 project or as an SCP project. If the project is funded through the ATP funding, applicants can simply withdraw that application and the SCP application if it's already been funded through another funding source. This is kind of our scoring breakdown. The first focus area is project need. That includes mobility need and safety need, as well as the disadvantaged community and public health components. Focus area 2 is the desired project outcomes. This is where we want to look really detailed at the scope of work. What are some of the public health strategies, the community engagement strategies, and the project benefits? And the third focus area is looking at partnerships and engagement. Is the project cost effective, and who are you intending to work with as part of the project? This is where letters of not just support, but letters of commitment go a long way. Next slide, please. There are some additional items that you're going to need to prepare to and upload. You can find those on our website, and Hannah Brunel has already posted that website in the chat. We have sample scopes of work for the community or area-wide plans, quick build projects, and network visioning and implementation. The scoring rubrics are also included in there, which will allow you to really gauge your answers towards what we're looking for. We would urge you to check out those resources on the website. And obviously, if you guys have any additional questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to respond to those as soon as possible. Next question, or next slide, please.
All right, a note on Go Human support. Applicants are encouraged to prioritize and propose robust community engagement strategies. Go Human, which is SCAG's Active Transportation Safety and Encouragement program, has lots of resources available to applicants and to jurisdictions. Resources include things like educational materials, the graphics for lawn signs or banners, other advertisements, and we also have our kit of parts available. We now have 4 kits that include different modular elements to showcase temporary safety designs, like a parklet, which you see on the upper left, or a artistic crosswalk on the upper right, or a protected bike lane. So these are all available. We are encouraging you to integrate these into your community engagement strategies. You can advance to the next slide. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the active transportation focused community-wide or area-wide plans. As I mentioned earlier, there's up to 500,000 available for these types of plans. The projects have to identify, the plan has to identify priority projects and should include essentially cut sheets, for lack of a better term, for priority projects. Those cut sheets should include conceptual renderings that include the public right-of-way, engineering cost estimates, and detailed project descriptions. The intent behind this level of detail is we want for these plans to produce the necessary documents for folks to be able to directly apply for ATP funds and be able to meet the project study equivalent requirements of those plans. So this level of detail is what will be required in those active transportation applications. And we want to make sure that there's not a gap between what is planned for and going after those funds. Example projects of these can include active transportation plans, bicycle or pedestrian master plans, and as it notes in the title, this can be a community-wide or just a part of a community, citywide, a neighborhood, whatever scale you guys want to go after. We also welcome multiple jurisdiction applications. If you want to partner with a neighboring city to do a joint application, that would be welcome as well. We would like for you to consider including the following elements: walking and biking audits. We really want the outreach to include on the ground observations and notes, allow for community members to be able to participate and provide in-depth information. I've done a lot of plans in the past, and this is probably one of the best sources of community feedback that you can receive. We would urge you to partner with community-based organizations, organizations that have a grassroots connection to the community where you're going to be working is incredibly valuable and can make for much more successful plans as well. And then finally, looking at our Go Human kit of parts and including temporary demonstration projects as part of your planning efforts to allow the community to actually try out some of these improvements and see what they like and point out what they don't like can really make for a more comprehensive plan as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Nathan Mustafa from the city of Riverside to jump on here and give a little bit of presentation on some of the work that they've been doing in Riverside.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you, Corey, and thank you everybody who's attending. Again, my name is Nathan Mustafa. I'm the city traffic engineer and mobility planning manager for the great city of Riverside. I'm very excited to be here today and talk about what we've done with some of SCAG's funding and their assistant over the past couple of years. Next slide, please. So the first project that I'll talk about is the Riverside PACT. This is an interdisciplinary plan that we were fortunate enough to receive SCAG assistance to develop. It's still in the works. We're getting ready to take it forward to another committee meeting, advertise the draft documents to our community, and then also bring it to our council for approval. It is an integrated pedestrian target safeguarding, active transportation, complete street ordinance, and trail master plan update. One of the things that we wanted to address as part of this plan was combining our infrastructure planning in a way that is equitable and in a way that is more connected than it had been in the past. Riverside has major events in its downtown core, the Festival of Lights that happens every year, unfortunately not this year in the same way that it used to because of COVID, but we would typically have 80,000 individuals in our downtown on the streets at one time. And so the pedestrian target safeguarding plan is really looking at those areas of public gathering and how do we mitigate or reduce chances of intentional collision. We wanted that to kind of blend into the elements of complete streets and active transportation in the city in the same way that we wanted to consider the interface between our trail network and our active transportation on-street network in a way that we hadn't done before. So we're very happy with the way that the plan is turning out, in the way that each plan component references the other, and the engagement that we conducted with the residents was also integrated in a way that we're hopeful results in a better final product for the city that can produce traffic calming results, provide for connectivity, and recreation as well. Next slide, please. So at a high level, the plan is also designed to align with a lot of the objectives that SCAG has for us as a region, and objectives that we are setting for ourselves as a city. The City of Riverside has a triple bottom line approach to sustainability. You can see here on the screen the core pillars of sustainability in Riverside are economic prosperity, environmental stewardship, and social responsibility. This was adopted by our City Council in March, and it's something that we are trying to integrate into our planning efforts so that we can have a consistent and sustainable approach to our planning documents and the infrastructure that's planned within those documents. So that was a core foundational goal for the plan. In addition, we parsed out some components that are more relevant for transportation plans, such as safety and accessibility. Those were other things that we looked at when we're identifying elements to pursue as part of the plan. Next slide, please. Another thing that we included was a ranking system or a priority process for the plans. Many of the bike master plans or pedestrian master plans often just read as a pretty long list of projects. And so, we do have that as part of our plan. It is in many ways a listing of things that we want to establish in the city. But I think one of my favorite parts about the plan is how we used the community input, used a lot of the data that we have available to us to synthesize a priority ranking for those facilities, to try to kind of take some of the the ad hoc decision making out of these plans and have true priorities that align with those goals of sustainability that I mentioned on the previous slide, and so that we can be confident in the decisions we're making when we're funding our projects. Also, by having things like reduced meal pricing availability for students, or low income statistics as part of the plan development, we're able to have projects that are also much more competitive for grant funding. So we're hopeful that by factoring in all these components, we have a plan that's a lot more actionable than previous plans that we've had in the city. Next slide. One of the big challenges with the PACT process has been COVID. We had done about 33 in-person events prior to COVID hitting. And then right when we wanted to start sharing the results back with the community and sharing the initial network and things of that nature, we went into lockdown. We were fortunate that our consulting team, Alta Planning, was ready and able to help us shift to a digital strategy. We already had a website and a online mapping tool and surveys available in English and Spanish. However, we were very pleased with the webinar that we hosted to bring the project out in front of the city. We had over 1,000 estimated attendees. We published it on our Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube accounts, and then also had it broadcasted over our government TV station. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that one of the core objectives of integrating everything into that PACT framework was so that each plan can refer back to one another. And so that's something that has borne out in the draft documents, and we're excited that we're looking in the active transportation plan at the trails network so that people can use it for transportation, and that we can ensure that they can actually reach the trails network, that we don't just have, like we have in some instances, a lot of trailheads that aren't accessible on street. And it really encourages just parking lots and people parking in residential areas just to get to an area where they can walk. And while certainly we want people and everyone to be able to enjoy our trail network, we want to make sure it's accessible for those who are living near it or those who might use it as a link in their commuting network. And then there's just a little graphic from our Complete Streets Ordinance there as well. Next slide, please. One of the big things that SCAG has done for us is really change the way that we approach transportation planning through their Go Human events. The two images on the left are from SCAG's initial, their first two Go Humans that they hosted with Riverside, and the third on the right we did all by ourselves. We're very proud of that. We did receive some financial support from our Council of Governments, WRCOG, which we're grateful for. And SCAG sent along some lawn signage that we deployed around the event for that. On the far left, you can see a diagonal crosswalk that was temporarily established in our downtown. In the middle, there's a lighted tunnel that replaced a historic pergola that had been damaged and cleared earlier that year. And on the right is our event connecting 5 Points that's in a pedestrian plaza that has some historic significance for the neighborhood. Right now, it's actually just a cul-de-sac, but we're applying for active transportation funding to activate it as a pedestrian plaza and install some bollards and decorative paving in combination with quite a few other connecting sidewalk and crosswalk improvements to reach that central point in the community. Next slide, please. So here you can see some of the results of the Go Human events. On the far left, that is near the 5 Points intersection. That's a piece of art that the community voted on and discussed as part of the Connecting 5 Points event that we deployed shortly after the event at kind of a gateway point to the community. It's called The Gift. Neat thing that you can't see in this image is that the leaves of the citrus fruit that are in the hands they actually spin, so it's kinetic art. At the center is right next to where we had that lighted tunnel. We've established what we've called our Tunnel of Heroes in honor of first line responders during COVID. That is actually a first of its kind lighted undercrossing in District 8 for Caltrans. We were fortunate that they stepped up and worked on a collaborative MOU with us to put colored LED lighting. The city deployed it under a freeway crossing. So that now is a gateway to our downtown that's inspired by the Illuminate Riverside Go Human event that SCAG hosted with us. And finally, while we haven't put a diagonal crosswalk yet at the location pictured on the previous slide, that event really did open our city's eyes to the benefits of diagonal crosswalks. One is slated for each of the locations where we did a pilot install through Go Human. And this one was installed just a few weeks ago by the California Baptist University campus. CBU actually installed it to ease access between their campus and some new student apartments that they're putting in. But our community's really embraced diagonal crosswalks, continental crossings, and safety enhancements for pedestrians. So we're very excited about all the different things that Go Human has changed in our community, and it's been real tangible change. Not only helped us with moving the needle with our own capital improvement funds, but we're also able to leverage that outreach towards bigger and better grant application funded projects. So we're very grateful for that. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nathan. I believe if you are able to stick around for the Q&A, we'd love to have you if there's questions that arise. And then I'm going to pass it over to Courtney at this point.
Thank you, Julia. So I'm going to be taking you through or walking you through a couple of details related to the community-wide or area plans that are safety focused. So just as a reminder, as many of us are aware, I'm sure, on average in Southern California, 1,500 people are killed, 5,200 are seriously injured, and 136,000 are injured in traffic collisions. And so each year, SCAG, in coordination with the state, with Caltrans, we establish region-wide safety targets. We started setting these targets in 2018, the same year that we began offering Sustainable Communities program funding for transportation safety plans. We're aiming to improve safety in the region, city by city, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, so that together we can work towards our goal of towards zero deaths. So this year we're planning to fund transportation safety plans up to $250,000, though I should note that they can be substantially smaller than that depending on jurisdiction size or project scope. As many of you may already be aware, our local road safety plans that Caltrans funds cost significantly less, sometimes well under $100,000. The projects proposed must include the identification of a high injury network or at least hotspot analysis, and they must also result in the identification of priority projects, including one that is the subject of a grant application. We want to make sure that the projects being identified in these plans actually, move forward, whether that's through ATP or through HSIP or another funding source. Examples of the project types are highlighted on the slide before you. This category can fund anything from Safe Routes plans, Division Zero plans, safety strategic plans. Today, we have invited Rachel Junkin, a transportation planner from the city of Long Beach, to share highlights from the city's recently adopted Safe Streets Long Beach Action Plan. And though this wasn't an SCP funded safety plan, because those projects just kicked off and they're underway, we think that this particular project, this plan, represents just the sort of project that we could fund in this category. I'd like to welcome Rachel. Hopefully you have access to, or we can advance your slides for you.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Rachel Junkin, transportation planner. I'm going to go over a little bit about the elements of our Vision Zero plan, as well as some of the lessons learned along the way that hopefully can benefit you guys. Next slide. So just a quick overview. Long Beach City Council adopted a Vision Zero policy in 2016 to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries by 2026. So we got started on the plan shortly thereafter. We actually had an SSARP grant that was very much helpful, and that collision analysis really informed was really the foundation of our Vision Zero plan. We went out to an RFP for the plan. Tool design was the prime. HRLA did our outreach, and Kittleson did the collision analysis that was so important for the foundation of the plan. And it's obviously an action plan. Our recommendations mostly were internal. Increased funding, obviously, and changes to the way we do design, education, and enforcement. We also included a number of items we wanted to advocate at the state level, primarily around how speed limits are set and enforcement of speeding. It was quite a long planning period. It was, I want to say, over 2 years. We had some controversial projects that put us back a few years. So you can see on the bar chart on the right, all of our collision analysis was a 5-year analysis, 2013 to 2017. So we finally got our plan approved in July of 2020. But even then, some of our data is already a little stale, right? So something to keep in mind, because you really do want that fresh data to make your case. Next slide. So briefly on our outreach process, so it's kind of divided into 2 parts along with a TAC, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So we did a host of pop-up sessions at city events, farmers markets, festivals, with a lot of interactive activities. One feature I really liked, and this was really from Here LA, was our listening bench. You can see the photo on the left, a gentleman sitting on the bench talking into a microphone. He was actually recording a story, an experience that he had with traffic violence. So we used those recordings and pulled some quotes and used those quotes throughout the safety plan, you know, really trying to not only tell the story with data, but with also these personal experiences that so many of us have. In addition to the pop-ups, we also had listening sessions. Essentially, these were just focus groups. We had 4, I believe. I wish we had had more, but definitely want to focus those listening sessions on your vulnerable road users, older adults, the biking and walking public. One with kids would have been really great. Yeah, next slide. I mentioned our TAC. I can't stress enough the importance of having a TAC in this process. Not only to get those external advocacy groups at the table. You can see at the bottom there we had our walking and biking advocacy groups along with our older adult advocacy group, the Gray Panthers. But you really want to make sure your internal stakeholders are at the table, because this will be an interdepartmental effort. You know, you want to have PD and fire. If it's a Vision Zero plan, you can't really do it without their support and everyone being on the same page. Obviously, we had our health department who does our education. And external agencies, transit, school district, metro, all were really key in the formation of the plan. Next slide. So this is just kind of a overview of how we organized the plan. This was a Vision Zero plan. I know Courtney mentioned there are a variety of safety related plans you can do, but I think this is pretty much standard for most Vision Zero plans. So obviously starting off with a letter, really getting that buy-in from your electeds, and then we had I think all our department heads that will have a part to play in this sign as well, chief of police, fire chief. You really need to tell the story of traffic violence and how it affects your community. Identifying the problem, not just with data, but with, you know, some people are visual learners, some people will be more affected by the data, some people will be more affected by photos, but you really need to tell the story, because you do have folks who might not see these safety issues as a problem. So you're making an argument in this plan. You know, a lot of folks think these are inevitable fatalities and serious injuries, and you need to argue otherwise. High injury network, as Courtney mentioned, you need to do your collision analysis to identify your high injury corridors and intersections. I'll show our map later on. Case studies show what, you know, your recommendations will look like, either, you know, projects you're proud of in your own city or in other cities. Action and recommendation. So we didn't have specific infrastructure projects listed. I think it is really important, and Courtney mentioned that's a requirement. You need to be able to connect this plan that you're working on to a project you can seek funding for. Also to consider photos. I mentioned you're going to want to show photos of existing conditions and tell the story of how people get around your city and the problems they're in. And this can be challenging internally. We had also, I noted, a dedication page to victims of traffic violence. That was also internally very difficult, you know, conversations with our city attorney's office, things like that. So telling the story, I can't stress enough. And these internal discussions will be challenging. I guarantee it, but it's definitely worth doing. And then lastly, naming your plan. As you can see, we didn't call it explicitly Long Beach Vision Zero. We went with Safe Streets. You know, some folks argue Vision Zero has a negative connotation. Some people don't even know what that means. So think about what name works best for your community and what will resonate with your residents, you know, before you kind of start that outreach process and brand your effort. Next slide. Really quickly, so we have a number of graphs and charts to really showcase the data that came out of our collision analysis. This is just one of them, but I always found this really useful in showing who our vulnerable road users are. So bicyclists, pedestrians, and motorcyclists make up 14% of those involved in all collisions, but 65% of victims of severe collisions. So really getting to why we're recommending the active transportation and speed reduction recommendations that are so prominent in the plan. And I'll include a link in the chat after my presentation to our plan, so you can look at it yourself. I do recommend just taking a look at as many safety plans, analogous plans out there. San Francisco and DC were kind of the ones that stood out to me, but there's so many great plans out there. Next slide. I mentioned case studies. I just wanted to showcase this cut sheet on the far right. So we wanted to show kind of how we've already been doing some of the work and what we want to push for more aggressively with the adoption of this plan. So the 6th Street Bike Boulevard included, this is just a snapshot of one intersection that was a roundabout. You know, this particular intersection included shortened ped crossings. It is a bike boulevard, reduced car-to-car, the severity of car-to-car crashes is reduced with a roundabout. So just getting to the multimodal nature of this plan, you know, we didn't want people to think this was a bike plan or a ped plan. We wanted to really get at the point that this is safety for every road user. And so that can be a tricky thing to navigate too. So I can't stress that enough, that this is a plan for everyone that uses your transportation network. Next slide. And this is our high injury network, our corridors and intersections. So we broke ours down into, in red, we have our ped and bike corridor and intersections. And then in the yellow color, that's our motorcyclists and vehicles. You know, some people break this down differently, but I think this worked for what we were working on. And we have this map again in the plan overlaid with our disadvantaged community. Overlay. So and then we talk about how 73% of the corridors are in disadvantaged communities and 83% of the intersections. So really using that overlay to show where we're going to prioritize our next step projects. One metric we don't have that I think is really useful is, you know, X% of crashes happen on X% of the roadway. You know, getting at the point that so many of our crashes are happening on just a handful of our roadways, primarily arterials. I think this is beneficial for the public as well, to get a better understanding of, you know, what streets really need to be re-examined. Next slide. So these are our keystone actions. All of our recommendations fall under these 7 categories. I'll go through them very quickly. One, obviously, dedicating resources, so increased staffing and funding. You know, we asked for during a pandemic a couple months before furloughs, so that was great timing. Number 2, speeding. So we captured everything to do with speeding under this. So this included design, this included laws we want to change at the state level. We really wanted to get at speeding as one of the primary culprits of these issues. So we tried to stress it as much as possible in all our materials. Number 3, street design, pretty straightforward. 4, more education, really focusing on more driver education too going forward, not just walking, biking education. Just because there's a rash of bike-related collisions doesn't mean you should only target education for bicyclists. Number 5, data. So this came up a lot, and this really refers to not just PD-related data in the Form 555 and collision-related data. This also refers to before and after data for our projects, making sure that they're doing they're reaching the goals that we're stating at the onset, and also, you know, using data to showcase to the public that these projects that, you know, might inconvenience the drivers are worth it in the long run. 6, prioritize safety investments through an equity lens. So I mentioned our high injury map overlaid with our disadvantaged communities and prioritizing projects in those neighborhoods first. The TAC was bringing up equity consistently, primarily around enforcement. Those will be conversations you'll need to have early on. And we had equity infused recommendations throughout these 7 Keystone actions, but we also pulled out specific ones to highlight again on an equity specific page as well. And then 7 is just partnerships, policy and funding primarily through local, regional, and state stakeholders. Next slide. So this is my last slide. Again, just some of the lessons learned. Assembling a TAC that meets frequently is so key. It'll get you that buy-in that you need from not only your internal folks, but some of those folks that you probably should build relationships with anyways. One thing I think is really key is not only assembling a TAC for the planning process, but keeping that TAC going after the plan has been adopted, to really make sure that you know, you're holding yourself accountable for the targets in your plan and keeping those relationships going. Number 2, I think I touched on this, ensure traffic safety is not conflated with anti-car sentiment. So we had 1 council member vote no on this plan, and I think this was the issue. Was an interpretation of this plan as being just a bike first plan and not a safety first plan. Perhaps that was something we could have done better on, but it's something to keep in mind too. You know, having a group like Mothers Against Drunk Driving or a victims advocacy group, you know, on your TAC could really help, I think, with this particular issue that we kind of ran up against. Engagement's a little difficult. It is a data-driven plan, so the community is not necessarily going to tell you the where, but they can tell you the how of addressing these problems. So keep that in mind. It's definitely very important to do engagement, but it's a little bit different than most plans where the community has a much broader say in the where projects will be focused. Discuss enforcement related recommendations with the TAC early on. Obviously, this is key. You do need PD at the table, but you know, enforcement needs to be discussed early on, how you're going to approach that in your plan. You know, we focused a lot on really advocating for automated enforcement at the state level. That was something our TAC really wanted. We didn't really change enforcement as it's currently done in the city in our recommendations, but we really wanted to see more automated enforcement to show an unbiased way of increasing enforcement and tackling some of these issues. Clearly define how business as usual will change. So we got a question when presenting this plan of, you know, we're already doing safety plans. I have a photo of one of our road diet projects. You know, how is this project going to change? How is this plan going to change, you know, what we're already doing? I thought we already, you know, made our streets safer, as safe as possible. So explaining that this is really a paradigm shift and that you're really seeking to get the resources needed to tackle what you're discovering in your data. It can't be stressed enough. And lastly, build in accountability within the plan. You know, I think most plans and policies have a date, a year that they're trying to accomplish eliminated fatalities and serious injuries by, but also a year-by-year phased approach is also really important just to make sure you're reaching your goals. If you know, have a 2026 deadline and you don't focus on what you can do year by year, you know, you might slip up. So making sure you're keeping your council up to date, again, with the TAC continuing to meet. You know, you don't want this to sit on a shelf. And again, creating project specific specific projects out of your high injury network that you can go and seek funding for can really just keep that momentum going. So I think that's my last slide. My contact info is on the next slide. And I think that's it. I'm happy to stick around for the Q&A as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, so much. That was excellent. Great. I'm going to pass it over to Hannah now to discuss quick builds.
Great, thanks, Julia. And thanks so much, Rachel, for a great presentation. And again, my name is Hannah Brunel. I'm a planner with SCAG, and I'll be discussing our quick build project type. So quick builds are interim capital improvement projects. They're intended to be design build projects that facilitate opportunities to provide input, test out projects, and evaluate projects prior to full construction. So they're intended to be built with durable, low to moderate cost materials, and they can be implemented anywhere from 1 to 5 years to allow opportunities to collect data and evaluate the projects. And they are built with some moderate design flexibility to anticipate adjustments that might occur during community feedback or any design challenges that you encounter during the implementation. And part of the purpose of a quick build is to respond to identified safety needs in a community and really to help quickly implement safety treatments and also enable a community to more quickly benefit from improvements and overall improve safety and mobility in the project area. And as you can see on the slide, the project should also include a robust evaluation component, and that's really to analyze the benefits of the project. And this can range from mode shift to air quality to local economic benefits. And we also encourage partnerships with community-based organizations, local community leaders, to really strengthen engagement of the project and really help to bring in new voices to community engagement. And some example projects include pedestrian improvements. These can be enhanced crosswalks, flashing beacons, or bulb outs built with paint and plastic, or separated bike lanes. And again, projects are really intended to have design flexibility and to anticipate adjustments that will occur during the implementation. And next slide, please. And just to provide a few quick examples of what quick build projects look like on the ground, this slide provides an example of potential types of projects, including protected bike lanes, and like I mentioned, bulb outs designed with paint and plastic and some artistic elements. And this really is to help show different types of contexts that they can be applied to. Next slide, please. And here's just another example of a parking protected bike lane and a creative use of planters. And next slide. And also just an example of how you can do an interim design prior to construction to test out a project, to evaluate that design and gain community feedback that can lead to a permanent project. And next slide, please. And now I'd like to introduce Eric Seha from City of Palm Desert to talk about their project and how it led to permanent construction.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. As Hannah had mentioned, my name is Eric Seha. I'm with the City of Palm Desert. And today I want to talk to you about our San Pablo Avenue improvement project and how SCAG's Go Human campaign really helped get this project off the ground. If I can get the next slide, please. So the impetus for all this is back in 2015, the city was undergoing a general plan amendment, comprehensive general plan amendment, looking at what does the next 30 years of this city look like. And for those that may or may not be familiar with Palm Desert, it's geographically the center of the Coachella Valley. So we're halfway in between Palm Springs and the city of Indio. Most of the city has developed out with gated private country club communities that you may be familiar with that are out here. And the community itself is rather affluent and rather older. I think the median age is close to 60. So during that general plan amendment process, there was a real emphasis, well, how do we bring this city kind of back together? How do we identify a city center where we can hold events, really kind of create a downtown for the city that can bring back the civic and cultural life to the city itself. I'll get the next slide. And in that planning process, we were looking at this kind of main center portion of town, where we have the Highway 111 corridor, which connects all of the Valley cities from Palm Springs to the city of Coachella, as well as the city's commercial district along Highway 111. There's a Westfield Mall along that corridor, and then there's the El Paseo Shopping District, which is a higher end shopping district here in the Valley. Looking at this map here, we have the Civic Center campus where City Hall is located, as well as a 55-acre park, and the community college, College of the Desert there on the other side of San Pablo. In starting to plan out some of this work, it became self-evident that San Pablo and its intersection with El Paseo, Highway 111, and its connections to the Civic Center and College really identified itself as the center of town. And the yellow portions on either side of San Pablo there are actually neighborhoods that are part of the original city layout from the 1950s. And so it's really an eclectic neighborhood mix where you have some single family homes, you have some apartment units, duplexes. This is really where we have our most diverse housing stock in the city. We'll get the next slide. So this is what the street looked like at the time of the study. This is from Highway 111 looking north on San Pablo. There's a commercial node here along Highway 111, but you can see it's 5 lanes with a dedicated turn lane, as well as slip lanes to get you onto Highway 111. You can see in this photo kind of the challenge we had with the street. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a bicyclist stuck on this island while cars are maneuvering all around them. So not an ideal condition for pedestrians or bicyclists. Look at the next slide. As you move further down or further north on San Pablo, it transitions into a neighborhood residential district. Here on the left, we have a duplex, but we still maintain this 5-lane roadway configuration without on-street parking. And so vehicle speeds through here were quite fast, moving closer around 45 miles an hour. I know you see the 40 mile per hour speed limit there, but vehicles were going much faster through this area. And this was a 4-way intersection where this photo is taken. We'll talk a little bit more about how that area has been improved since. Look at the next slide. So as I mentioned, in 2015, we started this general plan update. We identified San Pablo as kind of the city center, and we started to think about what that actually meant. What does the street need to establish itself as a downtown street? How does it bring people to this area? And at that point, we were able to partner with SCAG and their Go Human campaign, and we were able to do a 10-day road diet demonstration. So what that meant is in that 10-day period, we put out cones, we bought box trees and placed those on the street. There are some temporary markings that were in place, and we demonstrated what a road diet from that 5-lane configuration could look like and feel like for the San Pablo corridor. And at the conclusion of that 10th day, we held a 1-day community event. And on that day, we invited all our community partners out, like the YMCA, the Desert Recreation District, the Historical Society, our Sunline Transit Agency, the College of the Desert, and our Coachella Valley Association of Governments, which was also promoting their CV Link project, and held a 1-day community event that featured all those community partners and really allowed us to invite the public to experience what, if you're a commuter already using the event area, that was one thing, but really have people go out to the site, promote the plan for San Pablo, and gather feedback and support. And at that event, we had close to 2,000 people actually participate. We had 145 surveys that were completed, and the response that we got was quite overwhelming in support of it. People, what we weren't sure about was how roundabouts might be supported for this project. Roundabouts are relatively new here in the Coachella Valley. We do have some, but generally they're not well received. in this suburban setting out where we are. But even then, with the roundabout, we had 83% support this idea. And what this event really allowed us to do was to hear from the neighborhoods on both the west and east side of San Pablo on how they felt about the improvements. So not just from the commuters that were using it, but from the neighbors themselves who were using the street on a near daily basis. Just off this, about a half a mile or so, there's an elementary and middle school. And so there are a lot of children that are actually using San Pablo in that current configuration for walking and biking. And what the users of that roadway told us was that the street itself, the design speeds were too fast and it was too unsafe for pedestrians or bicyclists. Look at the next slide. And so we heavily promoted this event, not only with press releases, interviews with the news stations, the newspaper, radio stations. We went out into the community. We worked with those community partners to really promote this event. And like I said, we had about 2,000 participants show up throughout the day. You can see here on the right side of the photo some of those temporary improvements that were installed and some of those kit parts that SCAG was able to provide in terms of banners and some artwork that helped dress it up. And again, the city started to put in street trees that were boxed on a temporary basis to kind of showcase this is what the road diet might look like and feel like with some shade trees and an elimination of an actual travel lane there for cars. Look at the next slide. And so these are photos from the day of the event. I wanted to highlight some of these because, as I had mentioned, the city of Palm Desert skews older, but at that event itself, excuse me, at that event itself, we had the families that live in those nearby neighborhoods actually come out and enjoy that space. So this photo showcases some of those kit parts that were also provided for that one-day event. If I get the next slide. And again, we saw a much more diverse crowd at this event than I think Palm Desert is used to. And so people really came out, enjoyed the space, got a feel for what the Road Diet Project could be like for San Pablo, and were able to provide us the feedback that was necessary to really accelerate this idea. One of the things that was provided by SCAG and Go Human is in that left photo there. We were able to take surveys. You can see little postcards that are tacked to that board. People are starting to share their ideas and their support for the project itself. Next slide. And this is more photos from that day event. And the photo on the right kind of shows you what that event day looked like with our cones, temporary trees, and artwork that were in place. Get the next slide. These are just more photos from the event showcasing, some of the community partners that were there, including one of our local breweries, La Quinta Brewery, which actually came out with the San Pablo beer just for the event itself. So that was a fun day. Also shown in these photos is some of the lighting that we were able to incorporate to showcase San Pablo, not only as a road diet project, but as an event space. Look at the next slide. And more photos from that evening of the event. Next slide. So what this project actually helped us to do was to, and what helped the city council see is that there was a lot of support to really reimagine the San Pablo corridor. A road diet project was not something that had been attempted by the city before. Most of the projects we do is to expand right away. So, a road diet, we're actually taking a vehicle travel lane away was something new. But the Vision San Pablo demonstration allowed the city council to see that there was support for this idea and to start working towards an end goal of actually making it a reality. So one thing I wanted to highlight just with this slide is that from the time that we were participating in the Go Human campaign back in 2016, there was a lot of work that went on beyond that to make it a reality. So if you're working on a Go Human campaign, I think it's really helpful to get community feedback through that process and to let your electeds see that there is community buy-in for a project like this. And to also be patient if you're a staff person. These things do take time. But ultimately, we were able to complete phase 1 of San Pablo earlier this year. Look at the next slide. And so these were the engineering plans that went together, showcasing on the left there is Highway 111. This is the San Pablo corridor going from your left to right, including a roundabout there at the San Gorgonio intersection and some on-street parking that was provided at the center of the street, as well as pedestrian improvements that happen on both sides of the street. I'll get the next slide. And this just showcases how it moves through the neighborhood, including a mid-block crossing there between Catalina and San Nicolas. With the next slide. And as I mentioned, this really helped give the city council confidence to move forward with the project. So this is exiting off Highway 111 onto San Pablo. You can see this is actually the completed project. Some expanded sidewalks on either side of the street, dedicated bicycle and golf cart lane, some enhanced crosswalk artwork, as well as some of that center parking that is in the middle of San Pablo. Get the next slide. So this is just featuring the parking that was placed in the middle. In this particular location, there was on-street parking already provided for the commercial businesses, and that parking moved from the edges of the street towards the middle with an attempt to really slow down vehicle speeds through here. One thing that was not ideal in the previous San Pablo configuration is that when vehicles were parked against the curb, they would actually back out into the bicycle lane, creating a conflict there. So by providing the parking down the middle of the street, you no longer have that situation where cars have to back into the bike lane. But also it helps the other drivers that are using the street to really slow down through this part of town. We get the next slide. And so we're just moving further north on the street. These are again the completed project, completed improvements. So this is near this is the mid-block crossing between San Nicolas and Catalina. Along the western portion of the street, there were existing community gardens, and we were able to provide some enhancements to those as well. This also shows not just the mid-block crossing, but on both the north and south side of the community garden, we're able to turn these former parking areas for the garden into pocket parks, essentially. So each one has its own theme. The one there on the left shows you a pocket park theme that includes a putting green. I think the one on the right is actually a bocce ball court. But on another one of those parking areas, we actually have some musical instruments. We have chessboards out there, just a whole range of new amenities for that neighborhood to enjoy. But this picture also highlights, some of the bulb outs that we provided at each intersection, as well as some of the planting areas that now encroach into San Pablo, as well as the on-street parking configuration that's there now. So look at the next slide. And this is just showing leading into the roundabout that is now there at San Gorgonio. Next slide. So, there's been a lot of support since we've completed phase 1 of San Pablo. And phase 1 is just the half-mile portion between Fred Waring Drive and Highway 111. Later this month, we'll actually begin phase 2 of San Pablo, which is north of Fred Waring and connecting to Magnesia Falls. And at that intersection, San Pablo will connect into the Coachella Valley's CV Link system. So this is a regional trail that runs from Palm Springs to Coachella. It's over 50 miles in length, and San Pablo will have a direct connection into it, including a cycle track along the western portion of the street that connects to the cycle track that is CV Link. So again, Go Human was instrumental in helping this project gain support and community feedback. And ultimately, the council was confident enough to program money and to actually make this, the improvements permanent. So thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That was wonderful to hear about and to see where things are at now. The project looks beautiful. Yeah, great. Hope you can stick around if possible for the Q&A. And thanks again. And I will pass it over to Hannah to talk about network visioning.
Great, thanks, Julia. And thanks, Eric, for a wonderful presentation. It's really great to hear how our Go Human campaign can help to facilitate a successful project. And so our last project category is new to SCP for this round, the network visioning and implementation. And so this project type is essentially a combination of both a plan and a quick build project. And we introduced this to really better position cities to implement complete and low stress networks, and to really help provide a timelier result of the planning process through an implementation of a quick build project, essentially within the same project funding. And this approach includes a phased plan to build out the network, starting with the highest stress segment, and really to ensure that there are no high stress streets or unsafe gaps in the network, and to tackle that with an implementation of a quick build project. And just to go into a little bit more detail, so this project category will include a development of a framework for cities to work with SCAG and a consultant team to conduct visioning and to position cities, as I mentioned, to install entire active transportation networks within a short to mid-term timeframe. And this is alongside really robust and meaningful community engagement, as well as evaluation and data analysis. And the framework will help to identify a phased approach for implementing quick build projects, identified through technical analysis, and prior to full network construction, to really take on those stressful segments. And as you can see below, some additional components. So we're really intending projects to include an analysis of the existing network, a return on investment assessment, facility design, education and advertising, and then culminating in the implementation of a quick build project, which will be going through a robust evaluation period. And as I presented before, also intended to have design flexibility to anticipate adjustments. And we're really looking for this to really highlight and tell the story of the project and the benefit of active transportation networks, to really better position cities to build out networks and be more competitive for state, federal, and other regional funding sources. And I also should say, if you are interested in this project type, we certainly encourage you to reach out to us to talk through your project. And we're more than happy to do sort of a one-to-one coaching opportunity. And next slide, please. And I'll pass it off to Julia to talk about our schedule.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. So we are moving through our first application workshop today. There will be one more workshop. It will have a similar content. There may be different panelists, although I think many of the folks that spoke today will also be speaking on the 21st. The application itself is due November 13th. We are anticipating our regional council to approve the 2020 SCP project list in May 2021. The California Transportation Commission will approve projects by June 2021. We are anticipating identifying and awarding projects in June as well, and projects to begin in 2021, 2022. And a couple additional resources that we want to be sure folks are aware of, and maybe Hannah, you could add some links to the chat. There is a program fact sheet on the website. This is really a snapshot of the most important pieces of the program and the application process. There's also a program toolkit. This is another useful product. It really highlights overview, and there are example project types and example past projects and what made them successful and meaningful. It discusses the project visualization tool. This is sort of an interactive project mapping tool to visualize and explore how your proposed project area overlaps with SCAG's definitions of DACs. And then there's also some content that you can use. There's email content, there's talking points if you want to make the case to others to apply. So we encourage you to explore all of these tools. We are also offering one-to-one application coaching. If you have questions about the application process, we are happy to speak with you and support you. We are invested in quality, meaningful projects, and so we can explore that together. And as I mentioned, there will be one more webinar on October 21st. Next slide, please. I will hand it back over to Hannah to dive into the question and answer session.
Perfect, great. Yeah, so now, we want to hear from all of you, and we have our SCAG staff here to answer any questions, and also our guest panelists, Nathan, Rachel, and Eric as well. And I'm also happy if you have a question, if you'd like to type it into the chat, I'm happy to read it out, or you can also raise your hand and we can call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask your question. And it looks like we have one question in the chat. Let's see, thank you for the tools. The map does not load the priority growth areas of the HQTAs. Is SCAG working on a fix? Yeah, so great question. So we actually turn those layers off when you first enter into the map, but you can turn them on there. If you go into the layers tab, you can actually manually click to turn each of those layers on. We decided to turn them off because it did look a little busy when you first enter the site, having the DAC layers on there, but you are able to manually turn those on. And if you're not, please let me know and we will definitely work on a fix for that. Okay, great. So yeah, I'll go ahead and work with our GIS folks to get a fix for that. Thanks for pointing out that issue. So a question from Justin Robertson. Can you clarify the engineering expected for AT plans? Should we budget for a few priority projects to receive engineering level cost estimates and renderings? Or do you expect the level of work for all proposed improvements in a plan? And I'll pass this question off to Corey if you want to take this question from Justin.
Sure, absolutely. Your budget should directly correlate with the number of priority projects you're going to do full cut sheets for. And what I mean by engineering level, probably figure it to be 10 to 15% engineering drawings. The priority being, though, that you've identified any particular obstacles or conflicts, or and you show where the right-of-way line is. That is one of the requirements for the preliminary study review equivalent that goes into the ATP application. So we'd like to see those as part of the final product. But yeah, how you scale out the budget of your project should probably directly correlate to the number of priority projects you intend to identify and develop plans for. So as an example, in the past, I've done a plan that had 5 top priority projects, and it was budgeted for about $100,000. I had a plan that did 10 top priority projects, and I think I budgeted about $250 for that one. And then I did a plan that identified 35 top priority projects and did cut sheets for all of those, and that was about a $500,000 project. So the budget of your plan should probably directly correlate with the amount of work. And that's one of the main significant differences between the active transportation focused plans and the safety plans, is that level of detail.
Right, great. Thanks, Corey. And just checking the chat, looks like question from Marco. Is there an application number or funds amount limit that an agency can request? And great question. And so we do anticipate the agencies may want to submit multiple applications. So in each of the online applications on the second page, we ask that you identify the number of applications that you're submitting and the priority of that particular application. But we don't have a limit set or a cap on the number of funds that a particular agency can request, although there is a cap on the funding per project type that is identified. So I hope that that helps to answer your question, Margot. And let's see, another question from Chris. Let's see, for conceptual renderings needed for community-wide or area plans, can we pick a corridor in our project area and depict what the corridor might look like with the proposed improvements? How many renderings do we need to submit? And Corey, I'll pass that off to you if you can take that one.
Sure. Short answer, yes. As you're going through the planning effort and the planning process, we're looking for community engagement rather than community outreach. The difference between those two is community engagement allows the community to select and prioritize what corridors are important to them and what they would like to see in the plan, whereas outreach kind of works in the opposite direction, where the city identifies the corridor and presents it to the community for feedback. We are looking for community engagement rather than outreach. And then additionally, once your community has identified a corridor that's a priority for them, our hope would be that you would do a full conceptual rendering for that corridor that includes that planning, that design level that I discussed earlier in that plan. And as I stated before, how you budget your plan should directly relate to how many projects you intend to do renderings for. So you tell us how many renderings you want to do. If you just want to do one, not a problem. But I expect that the budget will be considerably less than the maximum budget allowed if you're only going to be doing one rendering, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Corey. All right, I'm going to move on to the, someone just unmute themselves. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question in the chat from Margot. So this question's about housing element requirements. So in the guidelines on page 10, please clarify how the applicant is to meet this requirement due to the inclusion of SB1 funding at the time of award. Notice an applicant, sub-applicant, and/or jurisdiction is required to have a housing element in compliance with the state housing element law and must be current and submitted updated housing element annual progress reports. So I might pass this to either Corey or Julia, but I will say that because we are including SB1 funding, that funding does require that the agency receiving those funds have a current housing element that is in compliance. And so we are required to make that a requirement in this program.
So there's not really any requirement specific at the time of the application. As part of your SB1 reporting, you'll need to be able to they'll have on file whether or not your city has an updated housing element and will determine whether or not you're eligible for SB1 funding. Most cities that are currently receiving SB1 funding already are aware of exactly where they stand with that requirement. So I would ask you to look to your your budget and finance folks to determine whether or not you are currently receiving SB1 funding and whether or not this has come up in the past. But as I understand, this is a requirement for the SB1 funding. It's not specifically a requirement for our SCP program, but if you're awarded SB1 funding, you will need to be able to meet this requirement.
And I'll add, our analysis shows that I think just 6 jurisdictions or 3% have 5th cycle housing elements that are considered out of compliance with state housing law and would not be considered eligible for SB1 funding. Almost all SCAG jurisdictions have housing elements that are compliant. And we'd be happy to follow up and provide any additional discussion around this as well.
Great, thanks so much. And another question from Jane in the chat. Can you elaborate the timing of fund disbursement for projects begin? Do projects need to start after the projects are approved, after June 2021? Can funds apply to projects that started prior to June 2021, but still ongoing after June 2021? So Jane, if I understand your question correctly, since this funding program contains ATP Cycle 5 funds, we do anticipate the California Transportation Commission at their June 2021 meeting will approve our project list. And so after that point, we can begin the allocation process for the ATP funds. And we anticipate that projects will begin after the funds are allocated. But Corey, feel free to add any additional detail to this question, or Jane, please let me know if that fully answers your question.
I would just add that you cannot invoice for any work that was completed prior to the allocation date of the funds. So if the work has already been done, you will not be able to invoice to the program for those particular components. And Hannah, do you want to go over how the difference between grant programs and the technical assistance program that we're offering here?
Sure. So our Sustainable Communities program is a technical assistance program, and so SCAG will handle the allocation of the ATP funds, and we will handle the procurement of the consultant for your project if you are awarded funding. So we won't be dispersing grant funds directly to the awarded applicant. SCAG will handle all of the invoicing, all of the reporting requirements necessary. And so, you will really need to just focus on your projects and actually managing the project, and SCAG will handle all of the administrative and invoicing. All right, great. So I'm going to move on to the next question from David. Our transit agency is currently constructing a transit center. However, there are currently no bike lanes on the street where the center is located. If we want to develop a bike plan, which category under this grant should we apply for? And David, I would certainly recommend applying for the community-wide or area plans category to develop a bike plan. And if we'd also be curious to learn more about your project, and feel free to reach out to us as well. And Corey, if you want to add anything to that.
Nope.
Perfect. And let's see. All right, and another question here from Marco. So when a project is awarded, when will a consultant be assigned? Prior to or after the applicant receives its NTP? When does SCAG anticipate having consultants on board to support applicants? So Margot, this is a great question. So if you are awarded funding, SCAG will send a notice of award to the applicant. And then at that point, we will kick off the procurement process. And the NTP will be awarded to the consultant who is awarded that contract. And so we, the agency that applies will be notified of the award prior to the procurement starting, and certainly prior to SCAG issuing an NTP to a consultant. And in terms of when we anticipate having consultants on board, so as I mentioned, we will be seeking approval of the California Transportation Commission in June 2021, and then seeking allocation of ATP funding. So we anticipate, to start procurement at the earliest in fall 2021, and depending on the timeline of the procurement, which can be about 6 months, at that point, then a consultant would be issued an NTP after the procurement is complete. And Julia, I'm not sure if you have something to add to that as well, or Margot, if that helps to answer your question.
I would add ideally 6 months for procurement, and we are exploring ways to keep that as swift as possible, although it might be longer. And often an agency staff is invited onto the evaluation process for the consultant team so that there's close collaboration there.
Yeah, definitely. We certainly involve the awarded applicant in the consultant selection process. Okay, and another question here in the chat from Ashley Brodkin. Is there a deadline that the ATP would need to be adopted by? And so Ashley, if I'm understanding your question correctly, this would be an active transportation plan would need to be adopted by. So ATP funding has a 3-year funding sort of timeline. So once we allocate the funds and once we award the consultant the project, you have 3 years from that date to spend the funds. And with SB1 funds, it's a bit swifter of a timeline. It's a 2-year sort of cycle of SB1 funds. But typically, depending on the length of your project and the application that you submit, that would also determine the funding that we apply to the project. Right. And another question from Margot: to clarify, awarded projects would hold off start of work until consultant comes on board. And so to answer this, yes, typically the process that we take is we do procure a consultant for you, and that consultant cannot start any work until that NTP is issued. And another question from Chris in the chat. This is going back to conceptual renderings. Are renderings needed for the application? How can we provide proposed renderings when we are trying to identify improvements through the project? Also, can you please provide examples of non-infrastructure programs mentioned in the application? And Corey, I'll pass this question to you.
No conceptual renderings are required for the application. Conceptual renderings would be the final product or part of the final product of the plan that you're applying for. So you should identify how many projects you want to do plans for, and that would be written into the scope that you're applying for. The application itself does not need to have a renderings in it. That would be the product of the plan. And then for non-infrastructure types of work, things like temporary demonstration projects, pop-ups, like using our Go Human Kit of Parts, community bike rides as part of the outreach strategy. Those are the types of non-infrastructure components that would be incorporated into the plan, both during the planning process as well as written into the plan for future funding opportunities.
Great, thanks, Corey. And question from Scott Johnson. We currently have a Vision Zero plan and map that identifies priority corridors for safety improvements. We now want to start doing more detailed safety planning studies for the individual corridors identified. Are one-off corridor safety studies an appropriate scale for this program? And Courtney, I'll pass that question to you. If you're still with us, Courtney.
Sorry, I was having issues with my mic and my audio, connecting it again. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, no problem. So this is a question from Scott Johnson. We currently have a Vision Zero plan and map that identifies priority corridors for safety improvements. We now want to start doing more detailed safety planning studies for the individual corridors identified, or one-off corridor safety studies in appropriate scale for this program.
And the question, I guess, was, the thing I was trying to clarify is it eligible for funding? Is that the question, I suppose?
Sounds like it.
I think it is, as long as you are not getting into that detailed design work, which is not eligible for funding with these planning funds. So I think it can be done. It's just, again, that we would want to, not exceed, that traditional 30% threshold and getting into, the more detailed design engineering.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Courtney. And Scott, please let us know if that answers your question. And another question from Yesenia. Who can we contact for the one-to-one application coaching? Great question. So at the very end, we'll have a slide with my contact information and also my colleague, Julia Lippy-Klein. And if you visit our website, also, you can, see my contact info on there, and I'll share it in the chat as well. And all right, another question here from David Mock. If the transit agency does not have authority to implement the plan, i.e. creating bike lanes, crosswalks, can the agency still apply for the grant to come up with a plan and work with the city later for implementation? So Corey, I'll pass this question to you. If you can take this one.
Sure. For that type of work, you would be applying for the community-wide or area-wide plans, not the quick build or the network visioning option, because you would not be the implementing agency. But you definitely want to make sure that you have the local agency as part of that effort, and include them in the, you probably want to have them as a partner. Include a letter of commitment from them, that they're going to be involved in the entire process, and that they are going to be engaged as part of that effort, in order for your application to compete well.
All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, another question in the chat from Amanda. Another clarifying question: with the request for robust community engagement, how is funding allocated to community-based groups for their efforts and time? Through the consultant group, through the local agency? Will subcontracting be a part of the procurement? So this is a great question. So we are asking that agencies submit a budget as part of their proposal. And with doing that, we are asking that you budget funding towards including community-based groups into your planning project, into your quick build projects. And also through the procurement process, we certainly encourage including community-based organizations actually on the contract, or as a subcontractor, but including community-based organizations as part of your community engagement and building that into your project budget. And Corey or Julia, if you have anything to add to this, or Amanda, if you have, that helps to answer your question.
I think you nailed that.
You nailed it. Yeah, just really, really encouraging robust community engagement that is meaningfully, thoughtfully led with community-based partners that are deeply familiar with the project area.
Perfect. Okay, great. All right, and moving on, question from Margot. How or what are the criteria that will determine which projects will receive state versus federal ATP funding? If a project is funded by ATP funds, will they be infrastructure, non-infrastructure, or combo infrastructure, non-infrastructure? Great question. So as part of the allocation, SCAG will be requesting state-only funds. So we have been successful in getting state-only funds in the past. So we don't anticipate that we will include federal funding into these projects. And typically projects are non-infrastructure. And Corey, if you have any thoughts to add to that as well.
Nope, that's 100% correct. You should assume that we'll be using state funds, and for most of the categories, it will be state ATP non-infrastructure funds that we'll be using, with the exception of the safety focus plans, which will likely be using SP1 planning funds that we have through SCAG.
Great. All right, perfect. And let's see. It looks like that's all of the questions in the chat, but let me just go through and make sure we didn't miss any. And yes, great question. So also we will be posting an FAQ on our project website, responding to all of the questions that we addressed here and also some additional questions that we've been receiving. And so we hope to get that posted shortly and before the next webinar. All right, if anyone has any last questions, please feel free to raise your hand or type it into the chat. We also have our panelists here still, so if you have any questions for them, please feel free to ask them. All right, and a question from Ashley in the chat: can CEQA analysis be included in the budget? And so I will say that SB1 funds are not eligible for environmental work. So they're not eligible for CEQA. And typically we do not incorporate CEQA analysis because most active transportation plans are exempt from CEQA. And so SCAG will do an NOE when we allocate the ATP funds for the projects that are awarded. And a question from Chris: to whom should the letter of support / commitment be addressed to? Is environmental justice area considered as disadvantaged communities? So the first part of your question, let's see. You can address the letter of support just to the SCP program manager. And is environmental justice areas considered disadvantaged communities? Yes, so that is part of SCAG's identified disadvantaged communities. And if you take a look at our program guidelines, we spell out the definitions of each area that we consider to receive points in the DAC component of the project application. And you can also take a look at the online tool that we have that Julia referenced earlier, and you can see if your identified project area overlaps with an environmental justice area and the other areas such as communities of concern and SB 535 disadvantaged areas. And another question, do the panelist jurisdictions have dedicated translators or interpreters on staff, or does SCAG provide those resources? That's a great question. If anyone from the panel wants to take that, I will just say that typically, if we do include as part of the procurement for a consultant to support the project, we do include translators and interpreters, to have at community meetings and at pop-up events, and to also, translate project outreach materials into the appropriate language. So the funding for the project can support that as well. So Nathan or Eric, Rachel, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, this is Eric in Palm Desert. I will say that we were able to translate all our flyers, promotional material, handouts that we had during the event itself, as well as the survey, were all provided in English and Spanish. And that was something that we were able to do internally with the staff we already had at City Hall.
And I'll mention, this is Nathan with the City of Riverside, that translation and dual language material were part of the procurement process for us. So just like Hannah said, it was baked into the project for the consultant that we selected to be able to furnish those materials and provide translation services as needed.
And this is Rachel. Same here. English and Spanish primarily with our high level project info. We like to do our 3 language access languages, which is also Khmer and Tagalog in addition to Spanish. But a Spanish speaker was typically at our pop-up events.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And another question, if we include a CBO in our project scope or application and we are awarded, is the CBO automatically a part of the project? They need not go through the bid or procurement process. And Julia, if you want to take this question, but I'll say, if an organization is involved in crafting a project proposal, oftentimes they're not eligible to submit a bid on the actual contract. So, that's also something to be aware of as well.
Yeah, nothing else to add.
Okay, perfect. All right, I think that covers all of the questions that we received in the chat. If I did miss your question, please feel free to speak up. But if not, you might be able to end about 5 minutes early.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate the interest, and hopefully this was helpful to better craft applications. Again, please reach out to us with any additional questions, interest in one-to-one coaching. Please utilize the fact sheets. Oh, and we did have one other poll. If folks are still around, thanks so much, David. If folks are still on the call and have one more moment, this is a quick poll to understand if there are any other barriers to move forward with this application process. We invite you to participate in the poll. It'll help us understand what we still need to address or how we can better support applicants. and I'll read them out loud. So barriers to moving forward with the application: lack of staff time available for completing the application, lack of staff available for project management, support is needed to identify the project, project categories are not applicable to local need, anticipation of budget shortfalls due to COVID-19, there's interest in other planning dollars for land use and or housing, or something else. For those remaining, thank you so much for taking our poll. I think we could probably end the poll there. It's looking like the primary barrier is support to identify projects, which is excellent because that is something we can support you with. So again, please reach out. Our contact information is listed on the screen. You can reach out to myself, Julia, or Hannah, and we will be sure to connect you with the appropriate staff person based on the project type that you're interested in. And then, we do have one more poll. For those still around, last poll, just to help us get a better pulse on where interest lies. What application type, what project type are you interested in? Active transportation focused plans, safety focused plans, quick build projects, or the network visioning and implementation project type? Thank you, David, for these polls. This is so helpful. And thank you to those sticking around for these final moments to help us understand where things are landing. All right, we can close that poll. It looks like the primary interest is around active transportation focused plans, and there's absolutely interest in the others as well. So we'll end it there. Thanks again. We will follow up with ways to access the slide deck and the recording from today, as well as we will post the Q&A shortly. So thanks again. Huge thanks to our panelists, and hope everyone has a great rest of the day.